Good morning or good afternoon, depending when you're watching this video. Today we're going to introduce to the Reconstruction period and a lot of great changes in the late 1800s. You already have this piece of paper in your possession, I believe. So here we go, getting a little bit of notes to introduce us to what's going on. And then we'll spend some time today, especially with Transcontinental Railroad, and probably tomorrow with the Chicago World's Fair, launching us into the 1900s. The stuff that appears, the words that appear in red, go on your paper. For example, there we go. Reconstruction is a time period that what's coming after the Civil War. After we spent all those 4 years destroying each other and blowing each other to pieces, well, now we're going to try to rebuild the country. What's the Reconstruction period? It's after the Civil War, which ends in 1865, and it lasts until the end of President Grant's second term in 1877. About a 12-year time frame that we call Reconstruction. We've got to reconstruct the country in three ways. Politically, what do we do with those 11 states who claimed they had seceded from the U.S. and have formed their own country? Well, the Civil War really is about forcing these states to stay in the country. Well, what are they going to have to do to become full regular states again? Physical reconstruction. Of course, the war has done a lot of damage to the South. How are we going to do that? Actually, this one might be the easiest thing to do. Enough time and enough money, and you can rebuild things. Maybe the hardest thing to do is social reconstruction. What do we do with those 4 million former slaves? You can't just say, okay, you are free, go have a nice day. Well, we've got an obligation now to help these people find a place to live, find jobs, find skills, get an education. What's the number one thing that slaves who have been freed by the Civil War want? Yes, it's an education. They understand how important it is to be educated because that's how you can be successful. So, my encouragement is to you, don't fight off the education your teachers are trying to give to you every day. Don't try to learn as little as possible. Learn the lesson of history. Education is extremely important for your success. A lot of the argument is about who is going to control the decision making in Reconstruction. President Lincoln wanted to forgive and forget and move on. Congress doesn't want to do that at all. There are a lot of members of Congress who want to punish the South for the war. So there's a lot of disagreement between those two sides. And yesterday we did the story of Lincoln's assassination. Well, his death is going to just confuse everything because the forgive and forget people are going to kind of fade to the background, and the punish the South people are going to take power. 3 constitutional amendments are passed in the Reconstruction era. We often call the Reconstruction Amendments. Really important to how America develops in the late 1800s and into the 1900s. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. No more slavery in the United States. Number 14, Amendment 14, guarantees equal protection of the law to all Americans. And in particular, this was to protect anyone who had been a slave. The law is going to apply equally to everyone, no matter who you are. 15th Amendment, male former slaves are given the right to vote. Not female slaves yet, former slaves. That will come later. All women finally have the right to vote in a presidential election by 1920. It's going to take a while for that process to develop. Some really important stories that are going to take place in the late 1800s include cattle drives and new transportation, changing how Americans ate. Or people can round up longhorn cowboys or longhorn cattle in Texas, drive them by land and cowboys and cattle drives up to Kansas, and then put them on railroads and ship them off to Chicago, where they can be disassembled, packed into bags, cans, and everything else, and sent anywhere in America a railroad can go. So America's eating habits can change a lot. And a lot of actually professional sports teams get their names from the cattle drives, from college sports teams, like the Dallas Cowboys, the Texas Longhorns, the Kansas Jayhawks, and the Chicago Bulls. All of those teams get their name from some part of the cattle drive business. The Transcontinental Railroad is going to connect the country from East Coast to West Coast, and this will be a really big deal when that is completed. Lewis and Clark were the first Americans to make their way out to the Pacific Coast and come back alive. They were based in and out of St. Louis. A lot of gold miners going to California traveled overland routes. Well, now railroad is going to replace all that and make it much faster, much easier. The second industrial revolution is going to happen, leading to tremendous growth of cities. This industrial revolution is different than the one we did in class a couple of months ago, where factories were powered by water and big power wheels that were powering all the machinery. Now they're produced powered by steam, and that is going to make the amount of work machinery can do grow incredibly. Unfortunately, there's terrible corruption in the U.S. government with all three branches involved. Labor unions are formed to help protect workers in those new factories. Not all perfect. A lot of workers working extremely long hours on very dangerous conditions. And workers eventually begin to strike and to try to protest for better wages. Sports and leisure become a new important part of American life. Some sports even become professional sports, like baseball in the 1860s or 1870s, when Cincinnati Red Sox become the first professional baseball team. College football and eventually professional football develops. Basketball was invented in the 1890s. This looks like Grandma about ready to take a shot at a basket Grandpa is holding. Well, basketball eventually, of course, it becomes extremely popular. A lot of you play it or have played it. And finally, the end of the 1890s, for our purposes, the launching us into the 1900s, involves the Chicago World's Fair. Yes, in Chicago. I'm wearing my Illinois hat, my Monsters of the Midway sweatshirt. We've got the Illinois Central Railroad trains in the background, where my granddad Clark and my father had their first jobs. My granddad Clark made the Illinois Central his career. Based in Chicago, of course. And, well, the Chicago World's Fair is meant to show the world all the greatest, newest technology, including this really cool invention called the Ferris wheel. The Eiffel Tower was unveiled in the previous World's Fair in Paris. It's a world landmark, but it just stands there. It doesn't do anything. The idea of the Chicago World's Fair was to out-Eiffel Eiffel by creating an iron, beautiful sculpture that moved and does something. And that's what a Ferris wheel is all about. All right, you're going to work on some information about the Transcontinental Railroad right now. And I hope that you will learn about the Transcon and some of the difficulties of building that railroad, but the changes it makes in America as a result.